Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the fourth annual Symposium on the Digital Person, which is on digital identity in a post-pandemic world. This is the third session of the day, the afternoon session, which will be on the social science of digital identity. So it's digital identity in economic markets, chaired by the HAT Technology Systems' very own Professor Irene Ng, who will be the first person speaking. What we'll be doing for these sessions is doing 50-minute talks, followed by 5 minutes for questions most salient to those talks. And then we'll also do the general panel discussion at the end, just as we've been doing in the previous two sessions on technology and on the humanities. So without any more chat from me, Irene, would you like to begin?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Can you see my screen? Okay, everyone can see my screen, right?
Very recursive. Okay, yeah.
Okay, so right, guys, girls, I'm gonna try to play this. This is a piece of sets of slide deck that I've hastily put in simply because I completely forgot that I had a session this afternoon. I thought I had to present this morning and it was it, but I had to I think the session is about identity, and I just want to talk about three major aspects of identity and how I think about identity, and just leave it with you and with Michael and also with YoungJin. Very happy to have the two of them come in to this session. So let me talk a little bit about identity. This, as Imogen has said earlier today, if you've listened to her presentation, identity is complex. It doesn't matter because the reason why it's complex is because who you are has got different reference points. If you ask me, if my mom asks me who I am, I'll be her daughter. If my daughter asks me, I'll be the mom. We have many roles to play, our own references about who we are to the other, who we are to the world. All of that is a moving goalpost. They're all moving goalposts. I remember I had when I was doing my PhD, I had a really good friend in school, and she came up and she said, I'm doing work on identity. And I was interviewing this kid, and this kid came home from school. He's an American, but he's from an Italian family. He went to school and he came back, and he talked to his father, and the father says, so what did they ask you? And they say who you were. I says, oh, I'm American. And the father says, no, you're not, you're Italian. And he got very confused. So he went and told everybody, I'm American and I'm Italian. And then a few months later, his grandpa came to visit, and he came home, and grandpa says, so who are you? And he says, I'm American, granddad, and I'm Italian. The granddad was horrified and says, what are you talking about? You are Sicilian. It just tells you that in the identity space, it is complex. But let's be very, very clear here. We're not talking about identity. We're not talking about who we are, not at all. There are some quarters in the world who like you to think that we're talking about identity. That is not true. And so I'm going to talk about these myths. The reason is because when you move into the digital identity space, you have a lot of risk. And all these risks are either social risks in terms of your identity orientation, power, privacy, and the structural risk in terms of stripping away the context of saying who I am without the context may sometimes just deprive me of who I really am. And so there are many challenges in terms of who wants to know, who needs to know, who has the right to know, all of that. I've basically just put it on the screen to say, here is how I think about identity. And it's not a static concept. Because if you're going to get answers to this question, my question is, have you recorded it? Is it recorded? Who else gets to see it? Does it expire? And does it creep to something weird? And so this is kind of the worldview I have, which is there are different parts of identity here. Now, we all know this meme on the internet. Nobody knows you're a dog. This was 1993. Of course, today, everybody knows he's with a white and black spotted beagle mix and they're humping. The point is, there was a time where we could do a lot of things on the internet as a dog. What happened? Why must now be not dog, but something else? Now, the McKinsey report came out extremely useful to say, look, identity would unlock huge amounts of economic value. It's 3 to 13%. For individuals, it's access to financial resources. For institutions, it's reduced fraud, productivity, all of that. Don't deny it. Digital ID is important. But here's the myth. The myth is that your digital identity is the same as your real identity. It's not. A digital identity is only needed for a purpose. And often, the purpose can be achieved if you are a dog. When I am in an airport and I want access to Wi-Fi, I am a Dalmatian. When I logged into a new app, I'm a Labrador. Much of the purpose we want to achieve on the internet can be unlocked as an economic value as a dog. Now, there are some things you can't, admittedly, but there are many things you can. So there are 3 aspects of identity. 1, binding. The fact that digital identity binds me to an identifiable real person is necessary only in certain circumstances. If I want to open a bank account, you need to KYC AML me to death and make sure I'm an identifiable real person because of all the anti-money laundering rules. But 10 years ago, even that was not necessary. 10 years ago, all you needed was you open the bank account and you now have access to the money. Who you are as a real person really wasn't important. So binding wasn't important 10 years ago. Binding is now for some services. Authenticating. Here I am, just logged into my little gardening app. Tomorrow I log in. Are you the same one? Are you the same person? Now it's taken over by email addresses and logging with Facebook and all that. But all the purpose is authenticating, that I'm the one that was here previously. You don't need binding for authenticating. You just need to know I was the one who came yesterday. And finally, the third aspect of identity was I am asserting something. What are you asserting? Oh, I'm asserting I'm above 18. I'm asserting I need to be port-free. I'm asserting I've got peanut allergies. And what's happened is that you can assert and you can verify my assertion. You do not need my binding and you do not need authentication. So if you think about identity as being the 3 major dimensions, why are they all lumped into me being a real person? So why? Because much of the assertion that comes in is I have an allergy, I can't eat pork, I can buy liquor, all of that. And the verification gives it a lot of power. That power then achieves access. These are the assertions, the authentication, the binding that gives us access to treatment, watching movies, getting paid for work, renting an apartment. The source of power, therefore, are the data attributes of which we assert and ask for verification. The people who verify our assertions hold the power. The purpose is where the markets are sitting. So now we're looking at a market and an economic market where data attributes hold the power to verify purposes. When Apple and API came out with the contact tracing API, they have the source of that data attribute, who I have been around. That single source of power translates itself to assertions and verification that lead to purpose that actually influence multiple markets. Where I go, where I shop. We're now looking at data attributes being controlled at source, because you cannot use the Apple and Google API unless you're a public health company or an app. You're talking about data being attributes being used to manipulate large-scale markets. That is a hypothesis, and that is a statement. Feel free to disagree with me. And that's it. Is that controversial enough? Any questions? 5 minutes, then we move on to, I think, Michael. Well, there don't seem to be any question. John, nice of you to join us. You're muted.
So we have a question that's come in for you, Irene. What new problems? Oh, well, this is, so I think there's two here. Well, I'll read it out. So it's not just people who need identities. E.g., if I'm paying a company by bank transfer, I need to know that I'm paying the right company and not a push payment scammer. What new problems does this raise?
Does what raise? What new problem does what raise? So I think the question
it's corporate identity as well as individual identity.
Absolutely. Look, all of identity, corporate, individual, all sorts of identity, it's always for a purpose. But it always needs verification. Whatever you assert to be who you are and what you want to access has to be verified. The source of power is in the verification and where the data attribute sits. Who has the right to verify you? That data, who has the right, and where the source sits is where the power sits. And therefore the power to manipulate markets sits right there. It doesn't matter about you or the corporation. It all depends on what access to resources you wish to have, whether you're a refugee or whether you're a corporate citizen.
And right now, you would say that verifying power sits where, by and large?
Oh, I'm not saying at all. That's the whole point.
I know, but I'm asking.
I am dropping just a simple idea and framing it that when you think of assertion, when you think of verification, and you think of storage and source, you must think about it as the ability to manipulate markets. That's all I'm saying. I leave to the other, minded people who can then take that on their own agenda and trajectories and lead to different kinds of hypotheses. I hope it's hypotheses and not conclusions of their own.
Yeah, Irene, if I may just jump in, when you mentioned you can manipulate the market, so I can certainly think about some of the things I will be talking about. But what it reminded me of was this recent hacking that took place at the Twitter, because the hackers who stole the identity of these individuals could have really moved the market in a major way, right? And they, for some reason, decide not to do it. But it's really the assertions, verifications give certain power to certain individuals. But what I'm thinking about, going back to your example of Apple and Google, it's the combination of the access to data attributes and something else. And I think that's what makes this actually very interesting and challenging. The reason that Google and Apple have outsized influence to move the market with a few data attributes that they control, the reason that they control is because they literally acted as a duopoly of the app stores that controls whoever gets in. They are the one who gets to stay, right?
So that's one hypothesis. That is one conclusion. Right. I think we probably better to be moving on. James, if we don't have another question, or do you have another one?
No, just reflection. I mean, we've chatted on and out about how they connect to being like states. It's rather like states letting people participate in the market, isn't it? Ultimately,
that's right.
It's increasing the state-related functions. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say, because I think there's lots to get through, but no doubt we'll return to that. So,
all right.
Yes, Michael, I believe you're next. I look forward to hearing your presentation. Thank you for that, Irene.
Yeah, I have to say that as the only representative from a commercial company, I'm not sure how my view from a technologist perspective may be received. So John's previous session is a very, very interesting one to follow, I have to say. And I may offer one view after my presentation, just from a technology perspective, and maybe we'll see whether goes, if that's okay. So just a quick introduction about me. So Michael Liu, I work in a business unit within Arm Limited, responsible for smartphones, wearables, and other consumer devices. So my role is to try and understand the security and privacy challenges in emerging industry trends, and then drive Arm's product planning in consumer devices to try and address those challenges. So just a really quick intro on who Arm is. So we are a technology company. I'm proud to say that we're fairly ubiquitous in the sense that we are used by most of the population on Earth in some way. So what do we do? So we essentially develop and license hardware, software, intellectual property to semiconductor companies, and to allow them to produce chips or processors that essentially ranges from the smallest chip powering a camera in a contact lens that you wear for augmented reality to the most powerful supercomputer that's ever been built, which was announced last month. So our mission, really, if I can summarize, is to provide energy efficient and secure technology wherever compute happens. And that last bit is important, wherever compute happens. So just a short sort of history. Arm's success previously was because of the mobile evolution, and therefore energy efficiency is important because it's powered by batteries. And then in the trillion connected devices now, security is important, therefore energy efficient and secure. So the next question for us is, in this new era that we're going to look at, what is that next step? So I just wanted to share some of my experiences working in the digital identity space and just see how things have evolved and what we are doing in this space. So most of this has been already really talked a bit about by Irene previously, about the fundamentals of digital identity systems. The first one, my first experience was actually creating an account, what Irene called binding, on a 486DX computer, which was my dad's back in 1993. So I had to create a password, essentially, to allow the computer, in this case Windows, to check and convince itself that the owner of the account is here and is allowed to access certain things. And that thing was a program called Doom back then. That's what I wanted to do. So it's called authorization. So following assertion, what Irene said is this idea of authorization. So the basic concept here is binding in order to allow a authentication, in order to access a valuable resource. The whole point of any digital identity system is to enable business models. I will avoid talking about creating market, but it is what it is. It allows markets to be built upon the access, control, and management of valuable resources and services, the entitlement to those. So fast forward to 2019, as a result of Arm's success, we now have this mobile ecosystem that's grown from 500 applications when App Stores first emerged little more than a decade ago, to a global number of 8.9 million apps and 204 billion app downloads in 2019. And it is an era of big data, because this is what happens when you got an increasing number of digital services and increasing devices. So the latest research that we have is that by 2025, we will certainly be generating data constantly. The figure was 4,900 times a day. So what are the problems then? Well, there are quite a few, but I'll just mention two here that I'm concerned about. So there's the first one in terms of security and usability issues, and then the second one around which everyone here, I believe, are fairly knowledgeable already around the risk of data trails. So I certainly believe from a technology perspective, strong authentication is the problem solved. So the security and usability issues, I don't believe are hard problem to solve. They are more of a deployment economic problem now, by which I mean that technology and standards already exist to do passwordless authentication securely, what we call strong authentication. So, so ARM is a member of an industry consortium called FIDO, and we produce free standards for strong authentication to reduce reliance on passwords. And I have worked with two of the largest mobile payment platforms in Asia to enable biometric authentication for mobile payments using different standards, but the same principle as FIDO to do strong authentication. And the latest open banking PSD2 legislation allows that. But the data trail problem is a bit more interesting. So when the data we generate doubles every 2 years, across the many devices and servers, it's an issue that we are all familiar with in this audience. So we leave trails of our habits and circumstances, our relationships even, and our dreams and fears. So the way I always sort of talk about this is that the more data you leave, as anyone who's married knows, with increasing intimacy, it becomes easier to press each other's buttons, of course. So that is unfortunate fact. And essentially what this means, the current trajectory from a technology perspective, if we don't do anything, means that the cost of influencing outcomes, by advertisers or geopolitical adversaries will decrease. And I won't go into the implications here because we have got people far more qualified for that. So I'm just going to talk about how the industry has responded. And the title of my talk, the first one I call the cloak of invisibility. It's a technology response. So what is it? It's, I would say, what John would call technical solutionism. It's an attempt to hide the sensitive data of a digital person from the actual online transaction. So what this is, essentially, is a technology approach to say that, well, for example, sign in with Apple. So random email addresses and login details are generated so that you can log into different services to make different assertions, but it cannot be linked back to your Apple ID, so it can't be tracked. The COVID-19 contact tracing APIs can be seen in this lens as well, in the sense that there is a desire to say that, well, the purpose from that perspective is to enable contact tracing, to enable the alert, and it can be cryptographically proven that the tokens sent cannot be traced back to an individual or a device. So it is privacy preserving in that way, and that was the intention, and that was the requirement, and that was the outcome. And then there are many sort of decentralized identity efforts that John Crowcroft and many others also refer to, this idea of only revealing that assertion that enables a transaction without revealing anything else. All of these are ways to minimize data leakage or trails, or a lot of the risks that we talked about. And then there's the policy response, as we see it, which we call the chain of custody, which is essentially the number of legal obligations that are placed across all the different services, all the different data processors, wherever our data is used, given, and to prevent unauthorized and unconsented to. So to Andrew's point earlier in an earlier talk, but there's something more, because we're missing the market outlook, because I tend to now look at the fundamental purpose of digital identity systems, which is the whole point of a digital identity system is to enable business models, markets that can be then built upon access control of resources. So what is it that now we need to consider? And therefore, what should the digital identity system in the past need to become in the future? So that's the kind of problem space that we are concerned about. So to me, the problem space has changed, because coming back to what we are saying around compute, I think the problem space of compute has changed. So one example, so in my last company, as I said, we worked with one of the largest mobile payment companies in Asia to implement Fingerprint biometric authentication. So this is direct input of your fingerprint on a screen when you want to sign a transaction in order to make a purchase. However, it turns out that in many cases, they actually don't need that anymore to allow a purchase to go through. Why is that? Because the analytics engine already collects 220 other attributes regarding that device, that person. So they know that they have already entered the correct password 10 minutes ago, that they're in their flat. They have been in their flat for the last 3 hours, and that they're using the same store, buying the same item that they bought 2 months ago. So already we are seeing what we called interaction, a change from direct manipulation to interacting with what I call predicative, automated decision-making systems, which are external to us and that are driven by data and context. So to me, the valuable resource now in this new world is our intention. It's the unsatisfied need. Therefore, what is it? What should we be looking to from a technology perspective to enable and facilitate new business models? So that's the new challenge for us. And to me, one way I try to think about this is, wouldn't it be great to have a thing that I call a personal oracle to really navigate this new digital landscape? So wouldn't it be great to have something that helps us? But what do we mean by that? So it needs to have a few characteristics. The maximization of these will, set them apart from other kind of oracles. So in my view, it needs to maximize our agency and control. So the challenge there from a technology perspective is, how do you control and protect data when you have given it to someone else to process? What happens there? And then how does it always ensure that we are the main beneficiary? So one way of doing this is, how does it maximize our negotiating position to ensure that we always have first-party claims to our data sets, assets rather, and how do we continue to keep them safe on the devices, on the properties that we own? And then how do we allow data analytics without exposing the data that we own to continue to preserve our claims of those assets without weakening them? And then the third one is, and that's a challenging one, how do we maximize explainability so that we can make informed decisions? This is a much harder problem for which I'm not an expert in, and I'll leave it to others. But in my view, a key enabler is around transparency, around systems proving to themselves how they were constructed. What kind of data did they use to come to the kind of decision-making process? So there is a sense of trustworthiness and assurance associated with explainability. So it's quite a huge challenge. And to be honest with you, I don't think it's news. So what is ARM doing in this space? So as all technology companies, we start with problem statements. So we start with the problem statement in terms of, well, these are the key challenges. What are the technology response then to allow us to address these challenges. And the way we look at it is that we need a secure platform to allow multiple parties to collaborate, combine, analyze, and learn from sensitive data without exposing the data, or machine learning algorithms. So this is often referred to as multi-party computing, federated learning, or privacy-preserving analytics. So we call it confidential computing. And we see it as a foundational building block for tackling some of these challenges as a stepping stone to enabling a more cohesive, coherent, and hopefully more empowering technology response. So at the heart of confidential computing are secure enclaves. So Arm's role, in my view, is to provide secure enclaves to allow data to be protected while still enabling data analytics, and to allow assurance, to allow systems to be trustworthy, to allow verifiable claims to be made about how the systems are constructed. And the last bit is certainly how do we make it available to everyone, especially to developers who are concerned about consumer trust. So it's a huge challenge, and we are really just getting started. So there are quite a few initiatives and approaches that we are taking. And at the heart of our approach is working collaboratively with industry and policy on a common framework. So I'm part of a ethical AI committee within ARM, and we published a AI trust manifesto last year. So there are 6 principles, of which security, fairness, explainability, among others, are key principles to engage the industry with in terms of how do we move towards that. Of course, it's an ongoing conversation, and we're looking at working with the academic community to look at best practices in terms of research for trustworthy AI development. And furthermore, we are making privacy-preserving compute capabilities available, open source, through a industry consortium called Confidential Computing Consortium, run by the Linux Foundation. And almost all of the, I would say, the hardware and the cloud vendor industry is represented there. So just to summarize, I'm really stating the obvious here and also reinforcing Irene's point, which is that digital identity really should be considered an economic issue, both in the way that it unlocks resources, but also because the future of the management of those resources has changed fundamentally. It'll be related to data management and as well as a security issue. And to avoid accusations of tech solutionism, as John mentioned before, we do want to engage at the policy level. And one thing that I would ask for is this data and research as a validation point to really demonstrate that there is more utility, there is more value unlocked when we have control, when it's more transparent, when it is shared more compared to when it's not, so that we can make an economic case that the benefit of digitization, especially where data assets from the individual are used, should really be made one way or another. As someone has commented, we are quite a few layers below where most of the policy decisions and the economic arguments are made. However, we do want to engage a bit better to look at how we can help. So that's the kind of overview from someone very close to the code phase of dealing with cryptography, with dealing with hardware, dealing with a response at the technology level, which we have remit for. And I hope we can, contribute in a small part in the future. And to answer your question, Irene, in terms of so it's a personal view to your earlier controversial hypothesis. And in my mind, So the reason why I think the platforms have got such market manipulation power, I think one way to look at it is, well, that's because mobile apps is seen as the best tool to manage some of these technology responses. The other question I would ask is, what other tool would you use, and what is the cost of getting 90% of the population covered with such a tool for contact tracing? So there is a origin sort of an argument as to what is the investment in order to have that kind of market concentration. But I really am not going to be qualified to make such a comment in terms of. So I'll just answer it in another way, which is that how does tech solutionism different from other way of thinking, which is that with enough money we can solve any problem, or with the right policy we can solve any problem, which I call budget solutionism or policy solutionism. I think the bigger the impact, the bigger the unintended consequences. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Michael. Wonderful to have you speak here. I just wonder whether John is around and he wants to come in on some of the just 5 minutes to answer a few questions that you post on that, or whether we can just kick it down the road for after YoungJin finishes. John, you want to say something?
I just wanted to say how much I enjoyed that presentation, and how clear the thinking in it is, and how much I'd like to read some of the stuff that Michael mentioned, because the point I was trying to make was that I don't think there's anything wrong with solutionism per se. What's with it is the way in which it has been, in an unthinking way, infected, for example, government ministers and others, and the way in which it has blinded many well-meaning and enthusiastic people to the unintended consequences of what they're doing. I mean, the classic case in point at the moment is the chief executive of Facebook, who is an extremely bright guy, smart as hell, and he has created. And if you have experimented with Facebook as an advertising machine, for example, what you confront is the most beautifully executed piece of software I've ever seen. These people are really smart, and they're really good. And yet he has difficulty in understanding clearly the unintended consequences of what he has created. And I think that's what I mean by solutionism without reflection. And so that, I think this is a productive area for conversation, and I think I found Michael's presentation very helpful.
Thanks, John.
Yes, I think it's.
Sorry.
I'm just going to be trying to be a little bit cheeky and say, if Mark Zuckerberg is in the audience, could you step up, please? But I don't think he is. Thank you so much, John, and thank you, Michael. Let's just move on to YoungJin, and we will have a much bigger discussion around the social science, economics, and markets and business aspect of it after YoungJin finishes his.
Great. Thank you for having me here. Let me just first start my screen. See if I can do this reasonably well. It's always tricky. All right. So good here. Right. I hope everybody can see my screen. All right. So I am YoungJin Yoo, a faculty member at the Red Hat School of Management at Case Western Reserve University. It's in Ohio, Cleveland, Ohio. So I'd like to think about digital identity and privacy, protection of digital identity and its multiplicity, coming from a person who's been thinking about, over the last 20 years or so about digital innovation, how companies try to create and capture values by using digital technology. So not so much on the technology per se, but those who are trying to leverage it in their own sort of economic incentives. Here's how I'd like to think about our current status. The paradigm, the technology paradigm that we are sitting on now, which I think started in early 2000, maybe in late 90s, and then really the emergence of smartphone, put a fuel on top of it, and then just exploded the whole thing. If you actually think about it from a market valuation standpoint, it added like $1 trillion to the market, the value, if you will. If you think about the economic value from a market valuation perspective, Apple is top $2 trillion, Amazon is going there, Facebook and Google is getting there too soon. So, just looking at these companies, it's a few $1 trillion globally over the last 10 years. Not a trivial matter. I think, however, at the same time, I would make an argument that we are running into the end of that good run. That whole paradigm that sets us in this direction is now, I think, coming to an end. The argument that I would make is that because it is all because of the unintended consequences of these technologies that are coming together, it's a systemic interactions of the elements of technology and their byproducts are creating this unsustainable implosion of the system, and that the market, the overall society is reacting to. There's just so much of market failure and the negative externalities that are being created by these forces that are simply not sustainable. So I think we are in the search of next paradigm and new paradigm that would, that would take us to hopefully. And I think the direction can be found by looking at the themes of the failures that we are seeing in the current phase, because I think what we are likely to see is emergence of a new forms of paradigms that come up in response to these failures. So what am I talking about? When we started having this sort of combination of global infrastructure and cloud computings together with extremely mobile, powerful mobile devices in our pocket, there are two things I think that, at least the two things, people didn't really anticipate it. I think we didn't anticipate the rate by which we will generate data in all different aspects of our lives, not just in a mobile phone, but we didn't anticipate the richness of the dimensionalities that our data, the digital trace data, will cover, which used to be in separate industrial sectors. All of a sudden, they are all out there. The second aspect that we underestimated is the rate by which the computational algorithmic technology will advance. I was speaking to someone in the U.S. Who is really the one of the leading scholars in supercomputings and and so on. And he said even he and his colleagues were surprised how fast the machine learning and algorithms developed, the power that they currently have. And what happens is that these two, the richness and the multi dimensionality of personal trace data that is already out there, and our ability to digest and make incredibly powerful inferences on things that we actually didn't see, creates a very interesting challenges. On one hand, there are desires for organizations and business machines who want to leverage this power that is at their hands, or they can get it. On the other hand, no one wants to be on tomorrow's front page of New York Times and Wall Street Journal, being blamed for blatantly, violating people's privacies, and next Mark Zuckerberg, and being discussed in Irene's next year's conference. So no one wants to be that villain. So people became extremely careful about how we use this and so on. So my point here is that we are entering into a time and era where the privacy and then the protecting personal digital identity is no longer technology issues, no longer simply the policy issue or ethical issues or moral issues. There are all of those, but from an economic perspective, from a business perspective, it is simply a market failure. The people cannot do what they think they can do because someone has to address this issue. And again, I'm just echoing what Michael and Irene said, that it is, in a way, the market creation opportunities and market, or reversely market failure. And the original, I was going to spend some time thinking about how the technology has got us into this way. But I would just simply talk about we are entering into what I would call organic machine era, where the machines are not simply producing predictable, knowable outcomes. We are entering into a world where the outcome of what the machine is going to do that we depend on really is produced at the runtime. And it is coming from hardware, software, models, and data, and the bandwidth of the communication. All of these come together at a particular moment as we execute that code on the silicon. When the bits hit the atom, that's only when we begin to know what this thing is going to actually tell us. And big part of that is what individuals, users, want and what they're likely to do. And it is that whole opportunity that these machines that surround and support business activities in the industrial setting produces this highly what I would call unknowable behaviors and outcomes that they produce. And then how does the organizations deal with it? This is sort of at a very high level, one of the big changes that I think we are seeing now in terms of business and technology innovation space, compared to what I would call inorganic machines, where the outcome is pretty much knowable through our experiences. So what does this mean from the topic that we are talking about here? This is what I would call, digital first, highly, based on the, personal trace data. Companies are trying to figure out, your true state, whether it is your identity, whether your intention, whether your current, COVID conditions, and try to offer a solution that matches your current needs, and then, try to create value and capture some of the values. Now, it's nothing new here. So what does this mean? As I said, I think in this particular trajectory, there are three, at least, things that I think will be a major sources of market failures that we will see. Privacy is one, equity is another one, and sustainability is the third one. So Michael mentioned, how ARM began its whole business as someone who's talking about sustainable computing. He talked about, the confidential computing. And then I think, quite frankly, the equity is the third one, as the access to these computed insights become a condition for people to have access to services, whether it's government or business services. And if I don't have a means to access that computed outcomes, I'm simply excluded from the ecosystem. So then the equity in a different way, it's a digital inclusion in a slightly different way, I think an issue that we need to think about. And I would argue that current computing paradigm that we have is not designed this level of granular and multidimensional data and our ability to dynamically infer individual status. And this one is just going straight back to what both Michael and Irene mentioned in their talk, which is, in the past, think about COVID, for example. What Apple and Google framework is doing is that when I am tested, so the current model is that we are using the known state that has been validated, and then I'm broadcasting it through the trusted third party, in this case, public health authorities. Now, the problem of that model is that it is not fast enough. There's a delay in sharing that information, that verified and known state, information, data. So the alternative is that there are, just like, Michael's example of authentication, I don't need that fingerprint anymore because I have observable event data that is already in my possession. So the question is, can I dynamically and accurately infer unobservable state of individuals at a very highly granular level without creating the problem of privacy and ownership and identity? And simply, I think we are lacking that kind of infrastructure. We are lacking that kind of market where such systems can actually be operated. So, I'm going to, for the balance of my time, I'm going to just talk briefly about some of the work that I've been doing over the last 100 plus days with COVID risk management. And I already alluded, the limitations of what Apple and Google is trying to do. And again, it shows that the market failure, there are ways that we can do it. And then simply the current technology framework and the market where the personal data could be used doesn't allow them to offer something that could be potentially be done. So I always say that COVID is what we accelerating the chronic conditions into acute conditions. It's just like personal health data. So at a nutshell, what we are trying to do with our solution, which we call Share Trace, is by observing individuals' anonymized trace data, which includes your symptoms, self-reported symptoms, and then your location information, by which we can infer who else might have been encountered with you, and then bring these two things together through a anonymized hyperlocal network. And then what we are trying to do is we are trying to infer an observable state of each individual, which is whether they are infected or not, without actually testing them. Now, of course, this is a big hypothesis, and that this is why we are actually doing a research. But in a way, what the using the technology that Irene and her team built, using the PDA as one of the key elements, we are currently able to build the server-based architecture where this is anonymous PDA, where when you open the PDA, there is no personally identifiable information. But when we put it together through the network model, we can infer that person's state. Now, the person who has the key to that PDA, anonymized PDA, the owner of the device, mobile phone, can now then come and say, tell me what is likely to be my state. So that's all we do, right? Now, here in this case, we are using a server that is accessing these PDAs that are anonymized. but it comes with a limitation. So what we are trying to do is, potentially the next level is in the future is potentially creating wrong screen. Looking at the serverless, but yet non-anonymized the architecture. So, what if we have a full-blown personal PDA that actually has my information, but if there is no reason for us to pull any data out of that PDA, and then we can make an inferences of your state, and that inference score remains in your control through your PDA. So that's kind of like a direction that we're trying to take, and potentially that could.
1 minute, sorry.
Yeah, so I'm done. So this is where we are going with this COVID applications. So I'll stop here and then I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thanks, YoungJin. What he hasn't told you is that solution is about to be rolled out in airports in the whole United States in the next 2 to 3 months.
Airport and the small city in Northeast Ohio and a few universities, with students. So that's currently. So yesterday was a pretty big day for us because finally that the network propagation model inferring your current probability of infection or test positive was first time that it rolled in, through a field test. So that was pretty exciting day.
Great. Where's James? James, you want to come in on this? Right. I haven't been looking at the board in terms of the questions, so I'm going to leave it to you as to what those questions are. But I just want to thank YoungJin and Michael for really wonderful presentations, very different. The position of the economics and business aspect of this symposium is. I think one of the things I really value about this annual symposium is the fact that we've got a very, very different perspective from John and his session, which I really enjoy tremendously. I don't get to, unfortunately, work with people from the humanities and the policy side as much as I would like to, and also with John Cockcroft in the morning with the tech and the policy side. So unfortunately or unfortunately, I just end up mostly with very boring economists or very boring industry people and business people like the likes of Michael and YoungJin, although I wouldn't call them boring at all. But I think it's one of the things about the flavor of this symposium that I do enjoy. I just want to open up and say, has anybody got any questions for the session?
Yes, we've had a few interesting questions come in. The top ranked one is, I think it combines a few things regarding trust and then the nature of the enclaves that Michael was talking about. So I think this is regarding enclaves overall. Begins, isn't it in the eye of the beholder? Zuckerberg would state that Facebook is safe, i.e. a secure enclave that he thinks he has made. Might everybody think his digital product is a safe enclave? So I think there's if we analyze that, I think there's two questions I can see in that. The first is, why would people trust the enclaves that you're talking about? And the second is, what substantively, for individuals, how would you describe the difference between a enclave in Facebook, I guess probably just broadly the account that Facebook holds your data in, and then the kind of enclaves that you were discussing, Michael, that's been used in with ARM?
So I'll probably need to explain what we mean by a technology stack when we are talking about a service. So the mathematical term is secure enclaves, in our view, is a necessary but not sufficient component of what we call the personal oracle. And the 3 dimensions, I think, which you can use as a test to distinguish personal oracles from other types of oracles are, does it actually act on our behalf and extend our control? Secondly, does it ensure that we are the main beneficiary always? And does it place explainability and involves us in the decision-making process? So just consider the second one. Who is the main beneficiary? You owning your data or someone else owning your data? I think the simple test. The first one, does it extend your control? That is, do you envisage business models where third party can benefit from your data compared to ones where you are more in control of the monetization of your own assets? Which one is, you know, extending and acts more on your behalf? I think these three act in conjunction, in the sense that they are simple tests and they are always in a spectrum, of course. So that's the two sort of things I need to sort of explain. In the same way as we provide intellectual property that goes into making the hardware, there are operating systems, there are applications, there are services, and then there are legal governance frameworks. So that's the different layers, and we are really right at the bottom. So we are an enabler, and we are trying to create the infrastructure to allow what we call trustworthy computing in the future. But it doesn't ensure that it happens.
Can I just take a perspective of this, mostly from the way we've been designing the regulated asset in the PDA? When we use the analogy of a house, it's actually a very useful analogy to talk about who, when, and how you feel safe. And a house is really a good example. Is a house completely unable to be burgled? Well, that's not true. We hear burglaries all the time. You are not safe, really. Someone with the intent to burgle you probably can. And so what you want to do is to make sure that there is no intent, if possible. And if there was intent, it would be really difficult. And it's not worth the economic incentive, which means you don't have, you know, big safes being viewable by the outside world. And I think we think about that as a threat model in the house and how we feel safe when we design PDAs was very much like this, was to say that your stuff is inside, you feel somewhat safe, you feel somewhat secure, but you do feel that you have control over the doors that come in. I think many people who come into, when you talk about security and trust, forget that they are one of those people who are holding the keys of one of the doors. Now imagine if you had a house and someone you don't know had a key to one of the rooms that had entry to your house. It is not unimaginable to think you don't feel very secure and safe, even if that person of the holding that key is your grandmother's third cousin. I mean, it doesn't matter. And he could have the best intentions in the world. It's your house. And I think the question here then, to think about security and threat in that way, then to think about, well, it's your house, but it doesn't mean you're going to lock yourself up and then throw away the key and you're never engaging with the rest of the world. Of course you do. But how do you do that? And I think one of the really important things when we have to think about identity is, if you're coming to my house to get certain things, or if I'm bringing my house along to a building to access certain things, the issue of trust is in not just do you have access to the stuff in my house, but do you, whom I trust, have the staff whom I trust? And always, inevitably, the answer is no. Sorry, Facebook, there's no such thing as I don't trust Facebook. No, you don't trust Google. These are not people. Trust is not on an organization. Trust is some kind of embodiment of the people of an organization. And when there are a few 100,000 of them looking into a room, I don't care how you tell me, even with the NHS, it's not that I don't trust the NHS, it's I don't think you have any kind of system to enable a few 100,000 people, a few thousand people to come in where I don't have control over where you're coming into. So I think there are layers here that we need to talk about. That's not just, oh, do I trust an organization? Because there is no such thing. Do you trust people, and do they have the right to do things outside of your control, as Michael says?
We've chatted quite a lot about trust, which is an incredibly important issue, but I'd like to turn to a bit of, futurism at the moment. You mentioned, Michael, the concept of the oracle, which is something I've come across in separate research, albeit under a different label. When do you think that something like this personal oracle, by which I guess we could broadly redefine it as, say, some sort of personal AI based on making decisions for you based upon the data that's perhaps held in a vault or even a PDA, a hat, when do you think something like that is actually going to come into mass usage? And what, because that's tough to say when. So I'm going to give you two questions: when, and what preconditions need to be in place?
I think the other favorite phrase I've heard that I often use is that the future is already here, but it's just very unevenly distributed. So I think that there are different ways to look at this in terms of that spectrum. That spectrum essentially is, firstly, it needs to be principle based, so that even if you are not using all the latest technology, however, if those principles are met, you could say that you have the most satisfying those three criteria of personal oracles. But it's a very, very challenging task. The preconditions are, what kind of machine learning frameworks can deal with a distributed model where you have got data that's not available apart from through an API? And how do you improve those models through different layers of topology of devices, from personal to edge to cloud? And how do you actually still find those use cases which has got business value to really drive the adoption at scale? I always think that when is a Venn diagram of technology, business value, and policy. Only when these three come together in a concerted, focused effort can you accelerate that. Hence my earlier last statement in the last slide. Industry, in terms of technology, I think is there. Policy, I think, is thinking very hard as to, is digital identity a data problem or a credential problem? And I think it is going the other way. In terms of that business case, it's very hard, but policy and technology does make sense. So that intersection is what we define as a use case, which makes sense in all three. So I haven't answered your question on when, because I can't. You're on mute, James.
That was interesting. I like the way you formulated on how the when appears. I suppose to take on that idea and then to respond to Irene's presentation, we had a question come in, which is the personal oracle idea not a shift away from the place of verification power? Who is the verification actor in the personal oracle? So I guess, and then this person says, Mayan says, because someone who makes this oracle, of course. So I think there's two things there. Who is the verifier in the day-to-day of the oracle? And then there's the power that comes from the first time the oracle is created, I think, the authorization of the oracle itself. So Irene, perhaps would you like to respond to that idea?
Right. I have to be very careful here. I do not know anything about the personal oracle because it's something that Michael presented.
Well, like a personal AI. Yeah.
Okay. So if you think about, I think there are ways to look at it in terms of the carrot and the stick. If we understand that a source is a source of truth for a reason, perhaps as a citizen of a country, the government holds the source of truth, and you agree they hold the source of truth. If you believe your health authority holds the source of truth about your peanut allergy, they hold the source of truth. Where the source of truth is becomes powerful when a single entity is able to harvest them all into some place that can be verified. One of the reasons why Google is really powerful is because they are the source of truth of your economic identity. What you buy, what you search, how you do it. And Amazon is a source of truth of your economic identity. Most of them, and Facebook is a source of truth of your social identity, you know, so they are sources of truth. If you then say there's a personal oracle, well, it depends. What is this personal oracle to do? What are you verifying and access to what resource? If I am a refugee, I came in and I'm stateless and I don't have identity. And if I had to say I came from Sudan or I came from Libya, the verification of that source of truth is of critical importance. There is the source of truth, which may or may not be present, and the verifier of that, which may be a secondary place. There are power dynamics and there is markets between them. The way I see the identity world is there's a big dogfight going on, right? Underneath those layers, because what is now happening is, of course, the surveillance capitalism, but the big fight is the fight for the next 2 years. So if you take 2 years from now and you think about the personal oracle, everyone is in that space, right? Big companies are, you think Facebook wouldn't look at what's happening with the surveillance economy and say, all right, you know, I see the writing on the wall, I'm going to have to do something about it. Of course they're going to do something about it because they have the means to think about what's going to happen in 2 years. They're all coming to the exact same conclusion as all of us in this room. But what they do about it is that everyone is on the dogfight of who's the verifier, who's the sources of truth, where are they sitting, how do we get to be more powerful, how can we control it? And there are layers in those markets and the dogfight. In democracy, the way I see it, and in good, well-functioning markets, there are players at every single level of that dogfight. That gives it a well-functioning market. The second, the middle layer, the verifier, the source of truth, becomes the only one, you will start to have problems with the market. So I don't know whether that answers the question, but to me, I see that's where the dogfight is happening right now, because I can mostly see that's where the big fight is. Why identity is the big fight.
I suppose then, if the individual becomes the verifier of their own truth, then the individual is you know, that there's, you said that causes market problems, then that'd be an interesting new dynamic. So I guess then the question is, if we say that the individual, how is control, who owns the oracle? Is it the individual? Is it vested in them? Or is it some other platform that's, you know, leasing it or giving it to the individual in some level? Because that really has huge power implications, I would have thought.
I don't think you can ever control sources of truth. They are fully distributed. Your economic identity sits somewhere, your bits and pieces. I think the main power is the access to resources and who are the ones we rely on to verify.
This is actually, to throw a complete curveball.
Can I just further, and being the verifier doesn't really mean you need to own something. It means you are in control of verifying. You know, ownership is a separate thing, and that's why I say there are different layers. The right to contract is the right to verify, which is the reason why when we look at PDAs, we're less concerned about what's in it. We're concerned about representation of people to be able to verify and contract. So you've got to change the technological means to verify and to contract away from so-called property rights of the source of truth that could come through various channels. Blockchain people will tell you all the time, oh, this is a blockchain thing, isn't it? I could just put a hash to that and now everybody can verify. So, you know, everybody has got bits and pieces of that little elephant and say, oh, this is the problem. Actually, all of it is, because that's the way the market layers are stacked up.
I do think it is sort of interesting, just to sort of aside, we've been here today discussing digital identity and the capacity and consequences of distributing elements of that digital identity or functions of it, such as verification, as opposed to, you know, more traditional systems or people that would aggregate and do it for us. It's funny, we kind of have this technological debate, or sociological and technological debate. It's been going on at the same time as a the one that's taking place across the airwaves every day, it seems, in the news on the social level of our social identities. You know, people wanting to be able to state their own, say, ethnic or gender or sexual identity and not have, you know, other actors define it for them. It's just it's an interesting little irony of this conversation today, I think.
I think that's basically, I mean, to me, that's a symptom, right? The fact that we're not allowed to be as many dogs as possible, right? It's the idea that the personal oracle is one personal oracle. A personal oracle, if I take Michael's point, is that personal oracle working for me? It is, if I'm allowed to be a Dalmatian getting Wi-Fi from an airport, as well as be a Labrador to be able to get into a pub. It will work for me because the nature of human identity and human social identity is that we are multiple personas. If a personal oracle cannot project that and insist on some stable, state-driven identity, my personal feeling, that will just fail.
Interesting. How would you say the concept that we worked on of the economic identity plays into this, Irene, from the paper that we wrote, Homo Deticundus, that we struggled on for so long about the Latin regarding?
So just to give you context, YoungJin and Michael,
and indeed everyone else.
A lot of, yeah, and sort of everybody else. So one of the fixation I have about economic identity is that more and more people are willing to forego their notion of a stable or their identity, meaning I'm happy to be the Dalmatian you think I am, the stable person you think I am, so that I can access economic resources, buy things on Amazon, do this and do that. And because it's the GDP we're talking about in terms of trillions and trillions of dollars, the economic identity is now displacing that social identity whom we consider ours. It is worrisome to me as an economist because I think it homogenizes people, and in a well-functioning society, any product that homogenizes people also basically make them much more pliable to undue influence, shall I put it that way? So, heterogeneity is good. And so if we are not allowed to be who we want to be, but insist that we are identified by our economic identity, which is she prefers blue jeans over red shirts. She prefers blue shirts or, short hair versus long hair, because these are the things we purchase. The displacement of the economic identity of our own social identity is worrisome for markets because it creates power from targeting and segmenting. So it's a case of, when 50 years, I think you might have heard me say 50 years ago, when you woke up in the morning, the first thing you did was going to be different for 50 million people or 100 million people. Today, you wake up in the morning, I guarantee you, I think the statistics have shown 67% of people will reach out for their phone and start checking it. So we have, as YoungJin in his paper said, products are the templates of behaviors. We have been templated by the products that we consume. If we are pure economic identities, we become templates of those identity even more so. That destroys the soul of well-functioning societies, kills innovation really, and creativity, and that kind of that in an odd little way, it's a market failure in itself. So that's why I stress digital identity really doesn't have, or shouldn't, or have, or couldn't, may not need to be bound to a real identity. But because binding is not necessary, it can evolve to be something which you are being told you are. Amazon Prime customer, and that you need to understand. It comes with it a whole barrel of problems in well-functioning societies and markets.
I want to throw a connected question out, which is, we've talked about the concept of the personal oracle, which I guess you could also call a personal AI, and this space with this AI making decisions for you based upon the data you've created. I know that YoungJin, one of the things that you've worked on in the past was the concept of, I think it was ontological reversal, which, as I understood it, was at any rate in my understanding of it from scanning the papers, the idea that the digital may come to gain preeminence over the original physical idea. So just to really put our futurist hats on, could we see a moment where one's digital identity becomes more important than the underlying physical embodiment? And even, if we look at, Michael and I discussed yesterday, just on a pre-conversation, if you have a digital oracle, a personal AI that, for instance, is making all the buying decisions for your house because it knows when you're likely to run out of milk based upon your patterns. It also knows when you're going to be depressed, so it knows what films you want and what pills to get you. At what point does actually, the digital identity become more important than the human itself? When do humans just become less relevant?
I think it has already happened.
A few things in there, but I think.
Yeah, so I think it has already happened to a certain extent. Like what Michael says, future is already here. It is just unevenly distributed. But I think what I would challenge, others here is that when we think about concepts like a digital personal oracle or personal AI, I think we're still thinking a lot of tenets here is in the context of what I would call inorganic machine. It's there's a sense that we are thinking about singular machine, singular behavior, highly repeatable. I think that will get us nowhere. I think, it is there is no singularity here. The oracle, personal oracle, is not going to be a machine that we will put our fingers on. It'll be highly distributed, multiplicity. It will itself have multiple identities, and it will defy our ability or our desire to put it in a box. Because I think that's the nature of organic beings. And very fundamental philosophical definition of organic being is not being able to repeat itself. If it repeats itself, it's by accident, not by design. Or inorganic matters, on the other hand, you could actually always predict what it's going to be, the future state, based on your careful, the study of the past and current conditions. So if you just really think about where the technology is going with all this, I like, Irene's idea of layers, because that's where the one element of this being organic comes in. Oracle, the personal oracle, the multiplicity of data sources coming in, multiplicity of the differential access to different dimensions of data, and the way these things will run will create highly different ones. Going back to your question, James, the reason I said it is already there is because, companies are making decisions of placing their inventories based on their model of who you are, what they think who you are. So for them, it doesn't really matter whether you need it or not, whether you know you need it or not. They have already made a decision. So it's a matter of them telling you or just shipping those things to you even before your real you order them. And so if your real you realize, oh, I thought I needed it, and of course, Amazon, thank you, I'm going to use it. Therefore, I'm not actually going to go to Target. Now, they create huge disruption in the marketplace because they essentially cut out their competitors from interacting with, I don't care whether it's a digital or physical person. They just did it, right? So digital person in its own modality of being computed at the moment made a decision and had a transaction. Whether you gave that agents to that ID or not doesn't matter. It's a contractual issue. So Amazon comes in and said we are wrong, we're going to take it back, then that's fine, right? So I think it is already there to some.
Yeah, can I just flip that a little bit, because I think the question about inorganic and organic is really interesting. Now, I've just been handed a cup of tea by my personal oracle, my husband. He has also delivered me some very interesting cake that he thought I might like to eat today. He baked it, and then it's beautifully done, and I absolutely love it. He has put it down next to me. He doesn't really know whether I like it. He probably knows that I like it. It's come in, it's been delivered, I'm taking it. Now, did I consider that a threat? No. Why? Because all that was exactly, if it was Alexa, if it was Target, if it was Amazon, if it was inorganic, it'd be a very, very different beast. So in a way, we have to ask ourselves about our relationship with what we consider technology. Because honestly, if you ask me, I think my husband is the best technology that I've hopefully molded over 30 years of marriage. But for some reason, nobody thinks of it that way, but maybe because it's just so personal to me, right? But it's the idea of inorganic, organic. We need to interrogate our relationship with technology, what we consider technology, that those glasses are also technology, right? They are enhancement. The point I think we're trying to make is there's a notion of the inorganic, or which alien to ourselves that feels that we have been robbed of some agency as a consequence. He delivered a cup of tea. I did not for any second think that robbed me of my agency to get a cup of tea myself. If we think about how we think about future personal oracles, it's exactly what we should be thinking about.
That's a really interesting point. So I suppose, a set of points really, because there's a few that came out of the conversation. In a sense, you could almost say there already is a digital oracle, and that there already are personas based upon the data that we've created already out there. Each time Amazon is suggesting to you a new list of books, that's what's happened. It's just that Amazon owns that oracle and possibly the data itself, depending on what's going on there. I suppose then, an example that kind of framed my question when I went into it is a slightly different thing. You're right, we already are having these images of ourselves and our needs out there. What we currently don't seem to have so much is that we haven't granted those AIs or oracles or profiles, to use a less incendiary word, contract making powers for us, by and large. So it's that move to, it's not just the framing of the decisions, and I guess making the decisions about the framing of the decisions. It's actually, making contracts for us. Will I buy that milk? Will I buy that film? Who do I want to see? It seems to me that that's a further step up in the logic. So when Michael was saying, I do that.
We didn't authorize them. We didn't create them. It was not created for my convenience. It was created for their benefit, for their convenience. So there's, I think, the big difference. So what I'm pointing out is that the idea of this sort of personalized, the digital twin and so on, all of that is being created at the moment is outside of my. So it's a fraction of me over there, fraction of me over there, fragments me over there, which I didn't think, I didn't create, I didn't want, but they created all of that. It's out there. What I think it has to happen is that the whole relationship needs to be reversed, where I get to choose what part of me fraction you could see, and you could see, and they work on my behalf, not like it's one thing that I say, hey, Amazon, you have my authority to ship it whenever your representation of me thinks that I need it. That's very different from that I get to create my own representative and give to you, so that one is making decisions. So I think it's fundamentally different in that sense, right? So, yeah.
Interesting. Well, this has been a completely fascinating dialogue. I think unless there's anything more you guys would like to say, or Irene, if you have any concluding remarks that you'd like to suggest.
No, I think I'm really grateful for the two of you, and also for John to try for coming in and participating in this interesting discussion. I just hope that all others who've been watching us banter have been suitably entertained by our little quarrels here and there about different issues. I think it certainly has been very useful for me to think about the personal oracle, which I'll think a little bit more about. Thank you. And what do we do now, James?
We are now having a PIMS and drop-in session. Sadly, our personal oracles, the I's, if not AI's, didn't decree that every attendee would be, mailed a bottle of PIMS. So I'm afraid it'll have to be, make your own and then come join us around the tables. But at any rate, we'll be chatting at the remote tables you can see on the floor plan after this, and look forward to having some pleasant and stimulating further discussions. But thank you very much, everyone, for joining. It's been a really interesting day. I know I've certainly got a lot out of it, and I hope you have too. And I'd like to thank all of the speakers that have contributed to it. It's been pretty cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay. Great.